Isaac Harris and Max Planck had kept their Triangle Shirtwaist Company non-union, which meant they could push aside complaints about long hours and safety violations. On March 25, 1911, 600 employees filled the 8th to 10th floors of the Ash Building when a fire broke out on the 8th floor. Workers rushed for the exits, but the door was locked to avoid interruption and theft. The elevator never reached the 9th floor. The fire escape led nowhere. Hoses and ladders of the arriving firemen only reached the 6th floor. The workers began to jump. 146 workers, mostly young women, perished in the fire. Said a reporter, "I remembered the great strike of last year, in which these same girls had demanded more safety precautions in the shops. These dead bodies were their answer. In spite of public outrage, the owners were acquitted of manslaughter." It was a glaring example of the consequences of businesses' disregard for labor and government's lack of action on labor's behalf. To help itself, the labor movement harnessed its strength in numbers and organized unions.
Sometimes going in yourself does no good. You need the strength and the ability of the unity of those people together to require the employer to do what's right.
It was a revolution that stretched across lifetimes. The reaction of capital, government, the media, and even the courts would hobble the labor revolution for a century before it finally found victory in lasting reform. While there had been an industrial revolution that replaced master-apprentice systems with mass production, there had not been a labor revolution to adjust to the changes. There were no laws to govern the new relationship between employers and employees. The Massachusetts legislature told the Lowell factory girls the remedy is not with us, setting a precedent of government non-involvement. Workers banded together in unions, but even these were declared criminal conspiracies until Commonwealth vs. Hunt in 1842. The Civil War and new technologies brought giant expansion in industry. This created a host of new problems as robber barons were farther removed from their thousands of employees. Some workers, disillusioned with capitalism, turned to radical ideas. Radical or not, they saw that the only way for labor to be protected was to unite. 5 million people were out of work during the Panic of 1873. Of 33 national unions, only 9 survived. Wages and jobs were cut. Safety was ignored. On July 16, 1877, an unorganized and spontaneous strike began with the B&O in Virginia and spread across the country as frustrated workers demanded their rights. 80,000 rail workers protested, but they were stopped with lethal military force. Transportation was disrupted, property destroyed, and 100 lives were lost. After 2 weeks, the Great Uprising of 1877 had, wrote President Hayes, been put down by force. Now for the real remedy. That remedy was slow in coming. The reaction of businesses and government was to break unions and strikes. New hires were forced to sign yellow dog contracts, promising not to join a union. Workers who did join unions lost their jobs. Labor was further hurried in 1886 when the Knights of Labor organized a national strike for an 8-hour working day on May 1st. 4 strikers were killed by Pinkerton detectives who were escorting scabs to the Chicago McCormick Raper plant. A protest rally at Haymarket Square for those who were killed also ended in violence when a bomb was thrown into a column of policemen who had ordered the demonstrators to disperse. 7 policemen died and more than 100 people were injured. The public was outraged and labor was forever connected with radical violence. 8 men, most of whom were not even present at Haymarket, but who each had socialist or anarchist connections, were tried and found guilty. The judge had instructed the packed jury that no physical evidence was necessary for conviction. 4 men were hanged. New labor unions, like the American Federation of Labor under Samuel Gompers, tried to separate themselves from negative radical associations by working toward practical goals and avoiding new political ideas. During the 1890s, major strikes followed the pattern of the Great Uprising of 1877, where business and government reacted with force. In 1892, when the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers refused to accept a wage cut from Carnegie Steel, Henry Clay Frick locked the workers out, thinking this would break the union. But the union, joined by the non-union workers, went on strike and took back the Homestead factory. Frick hired 300 Pinkertons and a deadly conflict developed. 8,000 state militia were called in. Frick fought strike breakers, and by November 1892, the Union gave in, exhausted from fighting both business and soldiers. In 1893, when orders for sleeping cars went down, George Pullman lowered the wages of all of his workers 25 to 33%, but did not lower the rent on company housing. In 1894, frustrated workers called on the American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, to assist them. The result was a coordinated strike and peaceful boycott of trains with Pullman cars. Transportation in many areas across the country was shut down. Attorney General Richard Olney issued a court injunction under the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 and ordered the strike, which was disrupting the mail, to end. When the strikers refused, President Cleveland used the excuse of enforcing the court injunction to send in 12,000 troops. As Governor Atgill warned, fighting started. After 13 deaths and the destruction of 700 train cars, the 100,000-man strike was put down and Debs arrested. Many other strikes were attempted across the country during the years of the Gilded Age. Most of them fell to the combined power of court injunctions and military force. Around the turn of the century, muckrakers began exposing the dark side of American society. Progressives sought to right those wrongs. They supported the idea that collective bargaining of unions was a necessary check on the power of capital. States began passing laws protecting workers from yellow dog contracts, limiting child labor, or establishing minimum wages. The courts, however, struck down many of these laws, but change was coming. Teddy Roosevelt surprised both mine owners and the United Mine Workers of America when he sided with the Union during a coal strike in 1902. Both sides had assumed the president would send troops to help the mine owners. It was the first time a president had ever supported labor in a dispute. From 1911 to 1914, a series of industrial struggles and tragedies drew the sympathy of the American public and influenced government to consider change. The appalling loss of life in the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire led to the formation of the New York Factory Inspection Commission headed by Francis Perkins. The findings of the FIC resulted in 8 new labor and safety laws in New York. In 1912, striking Lawrence, Massachusetts textile workers sent 119 children to New York where they could be cared for during the strike. Embarrassed at the negative publicity, the Lawrence police tried to stop the next group of children from leaving. Women and children were arrested, jailed, and many were beaten. The bad publicity caused American woolen mills to give in to striker demands and President Taft to call for an investigation of industrial conditions throughout the country.
When the workers do not have a voice, management arbitrarily makes decisions. They had complete control over the workers' lives.
Another tragedy occurred in Colorado where Colorado Fuel and Iron paid their workers not with money, but with company scrip, which they could use only in company towns. When CFI refused to alter this illegal practice, the UMWA helped the miners strike. CFI immediately evicted the miners and their families from the company housing. They spent the winter in tents. On April 20th, 1914, the tent city near Ludlow was attacked by the National Guard, whose salaries were subsidized by the CFI. The tents were looted and set on fire while gunshots rang out. 22 people, including women and children, were killed, and a 10-day war took 75 more lives. The violence ended when President Woodrow Wilson sent in federal troops. The change in public opinion these events caused allowed Congress to create a Department of Labor, and in 1916, the Kern-McGillicuddy Act established workers' compensation in a nation where 15,000 workers a year died on the job. The Great Depression was the worst economic downturn in history. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt became president, 1/3 to 1/2 of the nation was out of work. The first step for labor reform in his New Deal was the North LaGuardia Act, which outlawed yellow dog contracts and restricted court injunctions nationwide. This was pivotal because it took the courts and the military, which enforced its orders, out of labor disputes. The National Industrial Recovery Act guaranteed unions the right to organize and to collectively bargain. Union membership soared. Unfortunately, many companies were not complying with the new regulations. After several violent strikes, the NIRA was declared unconstitutional in 1935. This same year, the Wagner Act restored much of what was lost in the NIRA. It also set up the National Labor Relations Board to review union elections. Companies could no longer claim that unions did not represent their workers.
Because of all the labor unrest that was going on, there was an attempt to say if workers have a voice in what's happening and they have sit down with the company and they together make decisions on how things will work, then things will get better.
These laws were tested in 1936 when GM refused to recognize the United Auto Workers as the representative of their employees. Workers stopped working and occupied the factory in Flint, Michigan. The effort was backed by the Congress of Industrial Organizations. The sit-down strike lasted 44 days and finally ended when GM agreed to recognize the UAW. Small steel companies and even Ford Motors were also compelled to recognize unions when police and strikebreakers' actions were caught on film. Around this same time, the La Follette Civil Liberties Committee exposed spying and intimidation networks such as these, causing the Pinkertons and others like them to leave the union-breaking business. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established the reform workers had sought for a century. The reform allowed millions of workers to move into the middle class, and their buying power helped the United States economy become the most prosperous in the world. Labor has had difficulties in the last several decades, but it may be poised for a resurgence.
I foresee a resurgence of unions to represent the workers and help them to get that income disparity back up.
The labor movement had revolutionized how people worked and lived. The heroes of the labor revolution and the reforms they won continue to benefit the lives of millions of Americans today.